Hello, and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne. We all know that life is hard, right? It's messy, it's unpredictable, but it can be wonderful all at the same time. My hope is that we can take a deep dive into self-development topics and explore life's lessons through book clubs, conversations, and interviews. And together, we can uncover the lessons that others have already learned to help us navigate this crazy, wonderful ride called life. Hello and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne. I'm your host, Marianne, and today I'm talking to Christy Holt. She's the host of Create Your Happy podcast, and she's a self-proclaimed happiness hussy on a mission to spread happiness as far and as wide as she can. She calls herself an adventure guide for life with a passion to help people get unstuck in their relationships with themselves so they can create a happy life and build the relationships they truly desire. Christy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here and to dive into what I know is going to be a really fun conversation.
Before we dig into some of those fun topics, though this could be fun as well, how does one get to be a self-proclaimed happiness hussy? That's a little bit of a different title.
Yeah, and I get people ask me this all the time, so I am more than happy to share where this fun new title came from. Basically, it was sort of given in jest, and my cousin was sort of teasing me for being so positive. And she kind of mockingly said, like, "Oh, you happiness hussy, you." And I was like, I am gonna steal that like it's hot, like start the car. I'm stealing that and I'm going to run with it. And so thus I self-proclaimed myself as the probably one and only happiness hussy. I don't know. I don't know if there's any others out there.
Well, technically, you didn't self-proclaim then. She sort of gave you that. So, you were anointed.
Yeah, she kind of did. But yeah, I don't think she really meant it. But yeah.
So what brought you into this space of, trying to really connect with people and help them find that type of happiness in their life and to kind of get unstuck in the spots they were unstuck in? That doesn't happen by itself either. Something brought you here.
Absolutely. And the truth is, I started as someone who was very unhappy. And I've always been like a fairly happy person, but I found myself a number of years ago in a rather unhappy situation. My marriage was really not working. And I found myself dealing with regular overwhelm and anxiety, like to the point where it hit me before my feet hit the floor in the morning. And I didn't quite know what to do with myself. I found myself really ultimately acting out some patterns that were not very helpful, like complaining and blaming and shaming myself and guilting myself and trying to do all of these things to change the world around me. And I missed something really crucial in all of that. And I think I might have known this prior to that, but sometimes we get into a situation or a relationship that ends up leading us to a place where we forgot who we were. Having kids will do this to you as well, because, oh my goodness, if there is nothing in the world like having children to completely change who you are, right? To have you questioning, well, who am I now? And at the same time, I was sort of dealing with what I lovingly refer to as just a momitis, which meant I was fully into the throes of being a mother, but I didn't know who the fuck I was anymore. I was so busy doing and being and creating and, putting everyone else first that I continuously came last. And it did not feel very good.
Yeah. And I know I can relate to that. And I'm sure most of the listeners can relate to that. And, the more I've learned on this journey myself and talking to people is, I also think the time in our midlife is when so many of us sort of wake up and they have those moments of, who am I and how did I get here? And who did I really want to be way back when? So I obviously a lot of us have these events or these things that sort of just push that to the edges.
Yeah.
But I think it's really that time in our lives too, where we just start looking back and reflecting and looking inward and trying to figure that out. And then the epiphanies can start, right?
Yeah. And I think there was something about sort of approaching about 40-ish, we kind of start to run out of unnecessary fucks to give, and we start living life the way that we want to. And this can happen at really any age, of course, but there's just something really special about sort of approaching, like you said, that sort of midlife point where we're just too tired to give unnecessary fucks out. We are just so busy and tired, and all of that unnecessary efforting, we're just like, nah, like, I don't want it. I can't keep up. And so we decide to make some adjustments, and we decide to make some changes, and we decide to do things a little bit differently. And this isn't always easy, because a lot of times the things that we're doing are running on autopilot. And I'll tell you what happened for me is I had this aha moment, kind of like, when you drive home and you're really in your head. So you don't actually remember the drive, but you get home and you're like, whoa, like I'm home, but I don't actually remember, stopping at the stoplight. How did I get here? And I had one of those moments in my relationship. Like, how did I get here? What things have I tolerated or settled for or accepted that landed me in this place where this is now where things are at? And that was a very uncomfortable realization that I may have, I didn't want to admit it, I may have contributed to some of what had gone down.
100%.
And and then sort of along with that, this like, holy shit moment, like, wait a minute, I'm the common denominator in all of my problems. Like, oh my God, it's me. Like channeling Taylor Swift, I'm the problem, it's me. Oh my gosh. And once I got past that initial moment of like, oh my God, it's all me, I also realized I'm also the one who can change it. In fact, I'm the only one who can change me. And despite my best efforts of trying to change the things around me, like I said, that was all a futile effort, because you can't change all of the things around you. Some of them you can affect, absolutely. But I'll tell you what, you're never going to have a lot of success changing another person who isn't wanting to change themselves, right? So you can support someone and help and guide someone, but if they don't want to change, it's not going to happen, or it won't last. And so putting this all together, I realized, like, I really need to shift gears, because all of that efforting and people pleasing and trying and martyring myself and exhausting myself to do and be perfect, it wasn't getting me anywhere. And I realized that I really needed to shift inward to really look at what I wanted for myself. And so these are sort of interconnected ideas here, because the truth is, if you don't know who you are, it's hard to define what you want. And if you don't know those things, well, guess what? You are probably stuck on a survival mode, autopilot sort of living until you figure that out.
Yeah.
So, getting in touch with who you are, what you want, and how you're going to go about doing that are things that all have to work together. And if you're not honest with yourself, first and foremost, about who you are, as many of us are not entirely honest, we're often hiding parts of ourselves we're ashamed of. We are, judging ourselves for parts that we feel maybe don't measure up. And we're wearing masks to pretend that we are whatever other people want us to be, or actually more correctly, what we think other people want us to be. And frankly, that's exhausting. It doesn't actually get us the outcomes that we want. And it leaves us full of frustration and resentment and unnecessary suffering. And so when I started to put this together and started to question, well, who am I and what do I want? Things really started to shift. It required me taking radical responsibility for my part in all of the things, which was sort of this like, oh my gosh, like, what have I contributed? And also created space for me to come up with new solutions to move forward and create the life that I actually wanted, rather than staying sort of stuck in this perpetual Groundhog Day of, I
agree with all of that 100%. I think there's a bunch of categories in there, or common themes, I guess is a better way to put it, that many of us sort of have to figure our way out of before we can take those steps forward, right? And I wanted to touch on a few of them with you. And one of them, so you said make space, and it made me think of boundaries.
Yeah.
And especially right now when we're recording, it's a super busy season, and we find ourselves often overmaxed. And part of that, and part of being able to manage that, is to to learn how to set really good boundaries. But I think what I'd love to touch on is one of the things that I think you look at it a little bit differently. Your perspective, I think, is that boundaries are really around how to keep people in your life versus how to keep them out of your life. And I think that's a little bit of a different twist. I'd love it if you could explain that to folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, boundaries is a, relatively new concept in the last couple of decades. So we're not talking about something that's been around for generations, and something that a lot of us now, especially as we're approaching midlife, our parents were not familiar with the concept of boundaries, at least not in the way that we are now. And so when we look at boundaries, we have often a lot of misconceptions. People do see boundaries as a wall. They do see them as a means of cutting people off or cutting people out of their life, or even worse, sometimes they think that that means that they have to cut people out entirely. And I completely disagree that they are a wall. I mean, they do serve in many ways as a means of protection. They are a way of expressing yourself authentically. And in fact, I don't believe we can be fully authentically expressed without boundaries. So that is a critical piece of our authentic and full expression. But I think ultimately the way I view boundaries is they are an invitation into your inner circle. When expressed correctly from a place of love and with kind clarity, they are a way of telling other people exactly what it is that you require in order to feel loved, to feel accepted, to feel a deep connection. They are essentially an invitation into a more meaningful, deeper connection with you. Now, of course, not all people are going to be able to or are going to be willing to respect all of the boundaries that you set forth. We are, after all, unique humans with different perspectives and experiences. 8 billion of us, not one of us have had the exact same experience. So if we can remember that everyone is doing the best that they can with the resources and understanding that they have, we can come forth with compassion, and we can love people from a bit more of a distance when they cannot respect our boundaries. And I think it's important to clarify here what a good boundary actually looks like, just to further solidify the idea. And I think that when people consider boundaries as a wall, they think of boundary being something like, you can't do that to me, or I don't like it when you fill in the blank. But those are actually not boundaries. Those are personal opinions and preferences. Okay. So that's actually not a boundary. What a boundary is a clear communication as to how you will respond when a certain circumstance happens. So perhaps if you are going to swear at me when we're speaking, the conversation will be ended. I will not stick around to tolerate that kind of treatment, for example. Or if you're going to call me to complain about your partner, I can give you 10 minutes. Right? These are very clear, very simple, so that you're not on the phone for an hour and a half listening to your sister complain about her husband for the 49th time. These are very clear, and they're not meant to cut people out, but they are meant to show other people how you want to be treated, how you want to be interacted with, so that you can be at your best. And guess what? Those who truly love and respect you absolutely want you to be at your best. And now, to say that the boundary crossers don't love and respect you, it's not the personal attack either. It's simply they're seeing things through their perspective, through their lens. They may be interpreting your boundary far beyond what you've actually communicated. And so there are a lot of nuances here. And in fact, I talk a lot about boundaries in my program, Authenticity Unleashed, because there are a lot of little pieces that kind of come together here as far as not only setting, but communicating and then upholding boundaries. And so we don't have time to get into all of that, but I hope this gives a bit of an insight into my perspective on boundaries and what their true intention is.
It really does. And the neat part is that when you just told me and tied it to the program that you run and the title of it, The Authenticity Unleashed, I was actually going to say, as you're describing it, I'm thinking, I can see how it creates a more authentic connection and looking at it from that perspective, because you are really showing them who you are and what you're thinking, right? So often we might think those things, but we don't necessarily say those things, or we let ourselves get mad about it after the fact and we're festering because this thing happened. Your sister called and she talked for 6 hours about her boyfriend
Yeah.
that sucks or whatever the situation. But had we put that boundary on it, we would have said up front, hey, this is who I am. And this is really how much time I can give to this drama. And this is whatever the situation, right? And I can see
Yeah.
how it really does create a more authentic connection. And so similarly, if we move into another topic that I know you work with is people pleasing, it made me kind of go right into there because I was thinking about authenticity. And I was thinking about people pleasing earlier when I was prepping and thinking about our conversation. And I was thinking about the fact that, so many of the women that listen to this podcast that I work with in my Facebook group, that I'm friends with, whatever, we all grew up as people pleasers.
Yeah.
And I think many of us did that with the belief that it helps us create better connection, that it helps us kind of lock down the love or that relationship or whatever. And the reality is, and I think what you teach is, it's the opposite.
It is. Because the truth is, if we're not expressing ourselves authentically, and by the way, people pleasing is not authentically expressing yourself, right? We've been conditioned to be nice since we were little girls, and nice as little boys too. But girls have this sort of different expectation around nurturing and giving. That's just not quite the same for little boys. And so we have been taught, since we were 2 and we were given our first dolly to care for, that we are to give, we are to nurture, we are to be nice. So the problem with this is that we're not being, first of all, we're not being authentically ourselves. We are wearing masks, we are performing, and we are striving to have something or to create something by a completely false means of doing so. We are giving more than we are capable of doing. It's creating all kinds of resentment, frustration, bitterness, disappointment. And this conditioning has just run so deep that we feel like we must adhere to it. We must obey. We must fit in the box. And so many of us have struggled to, rebel against these ideas. And if we do, we're considered the bad girl, right? So there's this whole sort of idea that wraps into honestly feeling not good enough and also like we're too much simultaneously by some kind of freak circumstance, which means we can never fucking get there.
Yes.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
And just as you said, the more we are striving, to people please and to do all of these things, the further we are from the authentic expression that will allow us to receive back the unconditional love and acceptance that we are so deserving of. And here's why. It's not because you're not worthy of it. It's because you're not showing up as fully yourself. And when you don't do that, you don't actually create the opportunity for someone else to love and accept you for all that you truly are. They don't actually know the full version of you. And the worst part is in the back of your mind, you're thinking, if they knew the real me, they might leave, right?
Yeah.
And so you get trapped in this perpetual Groundhog Day sort of situation of performing, trying to be enough, trying to be perfect, trying to please other people so that they don't abandon you. And what it's doing is actually preventing you entirely from having that unconditional love and acceptance that you want. That's the whole reason. And there's an important distinction between being nice and being kind that I want to make here as well, because there is a lot of pressure for especially women to be nice, because if we're not, guess what? We're considered all kinds of nasty things, right? We're not classy, we're not professional, we're a B, we're whatever, all these things, right? And so being nice actually means to be pleasing and agreeable. Now, being kind is quite different, right? This is acting from a place of love. And now, of course, if you're a loving, kind, giving kind of person, you want to make the people around you happy. And that's not a problem. That's not a problem at all. That's humanity, really, in a nutshell, is we want to be able to give. The problem is when we take that so far that we're giving to our own detriment. We're giving to the point of our own suffering, leading to this frustration, this disappointment, this resentment, this really unnecessary pain because we're not setting boundaries, because we're not saying no when when we don't want to do something, because we're always saying yes because we fear disappointing someone. It's all kind of coming from this sort of fear of abandonment and this maybe completely unconscious belief that we are not actually deserving of love. And so we act so often out of this place, and we create scenarios in which we experience that which we believe on this deeper level. And so if we want to shift into receiving fully unconditional love and acceptance from another person, that's going to start with giving it to yourself first. Everything is an inside job. And all those times I was spending trying to get other people around me to change, trying to get my partner to be happy, which in my case, it was a completely futile effort, led me to realize the only thing I can control is myself. The only person I can make happy is myself. And of course, I do love to bring joy to other people's lives. That's, again, not the problem. But the problem is when you're doing so and it's hurting you in the process. There is a way for everyone to win.
Yeah, or you're losing yourself in the process. Yeah.
Right.
So that leads me very nicely, thank you, into so when you get to that point and you have that realization and you're now trying to work on yourself and you're trying to really be transformative in your thinking, the patterns that you had and the beliefs that you had, and realign your priorities. And all of that goes into into creating that self-acceptance and creating that version of yourself that you truly love, kind of leaning back into yourself.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges that I hear over and over, I've definitely experienced myself and talked about, is the inner dialogue, the chatter, the voices, just kind of repetitive tracks of all those limiting beliefs, and the sort of can get into this spiral. And now I'm leading you, but it's true, into this spiral of thinking and sometimes even overwhelm.
Yeah.
But it's really challenging to break those patterns because we have those old soundtracks.
Yeah.
There's actually a book called Soundtracks about this, but soundtracks that just keep repeating in our heads, right? And so I know a lot of the work you do, again, is to help people sort of break away from those patterns, to jump out of that spiral of overthinking.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about how that works and how you help people with that.
Yeah. Well, as you very nicely alluded to, in my book, I share my special tool, which I call the spiral stopper method. And this is, to tie this back into the earlier piece of the conversation, it's ultimately about creating space so that you can shift from reacting to responding, so that you're moving out of this autopilot survival kind of living and into conscious creation with intention. So ultimately creating a life by design rather than by default. And the problem I think that most people run into when they might not realize that they have a choice is, first of all, they're in survival mode. And when we're in survival mode, what happens is the logical parts of our brain, they literally go on like power save, okay? Because we've got to focus every effort in essentially not dying. Now, I know this sounds extreme because most of the time when this is kicking in, we're not actually in any real danger, but the way that our brain works, that's how it works. It thinks that we are going to have a problem with surviving. And so it abandons all unnecessary functions and focuses on merely surviving. So this means you're not in a great space to come up with creative solutions. It means you're not in a great space to really think through the response before you say it. And what this leads to is a whole lot of reactions. So oftentimes we have an initial thought, we have an initial emotion, and from one or the other, we build a story. And so instead of allowing those thoughts or emotions to just be, and the key to this is actually becoming the observer, because you are not your thoughts. That's not your identity. You are not your emotions. Those don't create your identity. They're information. And I lovingly refer to in my book this ongoing sort of onslaught of negative thoughts as your asshole mind. And what happens there is it just tells stories. So it takes that initial thought and then it runs with it, creating an elaborate story that builds builds until you're completely overwhelmed, you're completely anxious, and you don't know how to shut it down. And it is a trauma response. We don't have time to get into the exact details of that. However, what I can say is that there are tools to interrupt this pattern so that you can move forward with intention and learn how to navigate those things, because your thoughts aren't going to go away. Your emotions aren't going to go away. They're part of your humanity. They're part of what make you, here now functioning as a human being. And so we actually don't want to get rid of any of that. What we want to do is learn to navigate it. And the spiral stopper is ultimately about just creating the space so that you can move through the survival function and into proper thriving, right? Where your systems are back on board, you're more able to respond with intention and actually move forward, consciously choosing the beliefs and thoughts that you're telling yourself. And so I realize when you're stuck in survival, you're like, well, I don't have a choice. Like, this shit's just happening and I don't have a choice. And I know because I was there. Okay. But it's just because of the way that I just described that it functions and you can't see clearly. So what happens if you start using the spiral stopper method, which is essentially a toolbox of resources and different strategies that you can employ in those moments where your survival instinct is kicking in, just to move you through that first 30 to 90 seconds, depending on kind of how you process, so that you can move through it to the other side without launching into the spiral. Guess what happens? You come out the other side, you're not in that spiral. You can actually create a positive spiral instead. So things can actually get better and better and better and better as you're consciously choosing the things that really feel good to you. And the better you feel, guess what? The better you do, the more actions you take to move you closer to those things. And we do create this upward spiral, which just honestly feels like a million times better than the negative downward spiral that so many people are stuck in, myself included, for, we'll just say, too many years. But ultimately, you do always have a choice, even when it doesn't feel like it. But by practicing some of these tools in advance, you'll be able to pull on them because they'll become more natural habits. Now, the time to work on yourself and make improvements to your life is not while you're in the muck.
In the middle of it, yeah.
Okay. When you're in the middle of that shit, like I said, your logical thinking, your conscious creation, it's gone. It's out the window. It's on power save. It's not happening. What you need to do in those moments is really just get to the place where you can sit with yourself and allow them to pass. And one tip I'll give your listeners right now is that more often than not, if you can sit with those thoughts and emotions for 90 seconds as the observer, which means you're just looking at them as they go by. Imagine that you're watching a movie. Okay, you're not in the movie, you're just watching the movie. So imagine your thoughts and emotions as though they were on a picture screen in the movie theater, and you're just observing them as they go by. Now, of course, sometimes we do need to act. And if you do need to act, obviously, by all means, do what you need to do to act on that situation. But more often than not, and I've experienced this myself, come to the realization that, like, I'm really overwhelmed. And if I sit with it and observe it, number one, labeling it can be really helpful. I'm feeling really overwhelmed. Yeah. And then as I sit with it and I observe what's actually going on, I often realize that what's overwhelming me is actually my own thoughts and my attaching all of this sort of extra importance to them instead of just observing them. Not all thoughts need your attention. And the fact that you are feeling overwhelmed is probably a good indication that you're giving too much attention to some of those thoughts, and they are therefore causing you unnecessary suffering. So in order to break free, the first step is really just creating that space so that you can get back to logical thinking and get back in a position of responding.
So two things that you made me think of why you had given us the explanation was, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Amy Johnson and her work. Just a Thought is a book that she wrote, but it's all about the fact that our thoughts are just that, they're thoughts, right? They're not us, they're just thoughts. Yeah. And she says it's like the weather. They come in, they go out, and just kind of watch them come in and go out. And then another tool that many, many months ago, I interviewed a psychotherapist, Byron E. Smith, and she said that a really good tool for us is to, when we're having one of those thoughts, is to think about it as a balloon. She uses a red balloon. And just when that thought starts to pop, just literally kind of envision it popping. So stop it in its tracks before it starts spiraling into a whole story. And I really like that visual because it works nicely for I think awareness, I always say this, I think awareness is the first step, right? When you can start identifying, hey, what's going on here? I feel it, I know it. And then you can kind of just do something like that to sort of snap yourself out of it. But then I think there's so much power in the pause, and it goes to your space. I call it a pause, but it's really just giving yourself that time to just not be so reactive, and to then say, whether it's reacting to something, whether it's eating a food you don't want to eat, whether it's whatever it is, being able to then say, what is it that I really want to do here? What end game do I really want to get to? And making that conscious choice. But the two things, I love Dr. Amy Johnson's work, and I love that balloon analogy. I always like to remember that because I use it myself. I think it's really good to help us kind of be aware and have a visual. A visual seems to be helpful.
Yeah, it is. I love that. I also like to suggest, a movie screen is great, but also remembering that you are, if you want to envision a sky with the weather changing, you are the sky.
Right.
You are not the weather patterns. You're not the clouds. You're not the rain.
Right.
You're not the birds. You're the sky, and you are the constant. You are there, and you are observing as things are shifting and changing. And it's always a good idea to remember in that it's always temporary. These things come, they go. They come, new things come, and they go. And nothing is ever permanent except you. Your awareness is the same awareness that was experiencing life when you were 5 years old. Your awareness hasn't changed. Your experiences have changed. Your reactions have changed. Your thoughts and your emotions very likely have changed. But the awareness that's observing it all, same one after all of these years. And so if we can remember that everything that's coming and going is temporary, we will free ourselves from a lot of unnecessary attachment or resistance. And the truth is, the resistance and the attachment, clinging to good things and resisting and avoiding uncomfortable things, is what leads us to a whole bunch of suffering. And if we can master this recognition that things are temporary, that things are always changing, that nothing is forever except our awareness, we will become freed from a lot of the unnecessary problems and pain that we're creating, most of it inside of our own minds. And yes, it's true, we can't necessarily control the things around us because we're all here co-creating. There are other people creating and, reacting and responding as well. And so while we cannot change that, the choice we do always have is in that response, in how we choose to deal with it. And the more we are intentional with that, the more we can create responses and experiences that feel good to us instead of ones that maybe are out of past trauma, or maybe are a defense mechanism, or maybe are just autopilot and we're just plain sick of it.
I love all that.
And one tool that I have created to help people to really start creating this space is I've created some really fun sweary AF meditations. They are all, it's a series of meditations. They're all under 5 minutes. And like, who doesn't love a little quickie? Ultimately, this is just for those moments when you just need to slow it down. You just need to create that space so that you can consciously choose how to respond.
And I know that we're going to put the link in the show notes to that. So I have a lot of folks that still are always looking to get introduced or figure out how to feel more comfortable in the sort of meditation and the, space of that. So yeah, these might start to be able to get them to that place of really just kind of stepping back and calming down and quieting themselves, right?
And if you're someone who has a super busy mind and you feel like you aren't very good at meditating, or you're doing it wrong, or you're not doing it for long enough, or you're creating any kind of rules around this, I invite you today to just throw that all out, because there are actually no rules for meditation. There are no requirements for you to sit in with your, there are no rules. Okay. So I'm throwing all the rules out with these sweary AF meditations, and we're making it fun. We're making it short. We're making it manageable. You're probably going to laugh. You might cry. And I hope that you're going to walk away feeling just a little more fucking zen than you did before. And that's the whole thing. Meditation is a practice, and they call it a practice for very good reason, because, well, frankly, no one's perfect at it. And I can say that after having meditated like daily for almost 3 years, and, you know, maybe not consistently daily, but for probably 5 years or more, I still have what someone else might consider a pretty crappy meditation, where my mind takes over and I'm listening, but I'm not listening, and I'm all over the place. However, at the end of that practice, what's important is that you don't judge yourself, you don't shame yourself, you don't make yourself feel bad or wrong. You celebrate yourself for showing the hell up for yourself, because that is what it is all about. And every single time you're able to create even a moment of gap in between the thoughts, you're making progress. So that is worth celebrating.
Yes, yes, yes. Every single moment. I think that's valid. And starting with just a minute or two can make a big difference. And it is a practice. You have to build the practice. Well, this has been fantastic. And I know that we'll put that link out there. There's a few other links. There's a link to your book out there. We're going to put a couple other freebies out there. So folks, make sure you take a look at the show notes so you can go check out all of Christy's work. And of course, she has the podcast. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And if I may, I would like to share one more little piece that I think is often missing for people. And I hope that this might just connect a few things back together from our entire conversation and really make it actionable for them to move forward and see a change in their life. And I think this missing link is to do with self-compassion, because we have been conditioned all through school to fit in the box, to color in the lines, to do what we're told to do, to listen and obey, and all of these things. We have actually built up, most of us, this tendency to look for others for validation. Self-esteem is entirely built on this premise of getting this validation from other people and performing, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea of self-compassion, on the other hand, has been one that has been looked at as perhaps selfish, perhaps as something that might actually make us unmotivated or complacent, or potentially just turn us into selfish jerks. And I want to debunk all of that, because we're not talking about, you know, an inflated sense of ego here. We're talking about giving yourself grace for being a human. And so often when we're chasing this self-esteem and these external validations, we miss the fact that we are the ones who can validate ourselves. And when we start to accept ourselves, this has to come along with the self-compassion, this grace for making mistakes, because you're going to. There's literally no way to avoid it. And the number of times I've seen people guilt or shame themselves and think that that's going to motivate them into changing, it blows my mind. But I think it comes from some of this conditioning that I've mentioned. And so I invite you to try on the idea of self-compassion instead, and to become basically your own biggest cheerleader. And by loving and accepting yourself first, you set the tone for all other relationships, not just interpersonal ones, but the relationships that you have, say, with money or social media or your job or any external things, because everything is a reflection of the inside.
What a great way to end. It's a great message. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you so much for providing the space and this incredible conversation. And I look forward to hearing from anybody who wants to carry the conversation on further.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Message in the Middle with Marianne. If you enjoyed the podcast, please take a minute to share it and write a review, as it helps bring new listeners to our audience. If you'd like to keep the conversation going between episodes, please join us at Facebook group Message in the Middle with Marianne.